Okay, today we're going to talk about the kingdom of fungi. This is a very broad kingdom, very successful kingdom, find fungi everywhere. They're closely related to animals. You wouldn't tell by that by looking at them. They look more like plants than animals, but if you look at their molecular biology, we are more closely related to fungi than plants are to fungi. We belong to a group called the Opisthocons, and that is a group that we talked about before with protists. That includes choanoflagellates and animals. And one of the things that you saw is that choanoflagellates have this long flagella. So we'll talk about the flagella a little bit later on when we get to the first group of fungi we'll look at. So here's just some information about fungi. There's quite a bit of known species. What's interesting about fungi is they're generally cells generally are haploid, which is really different than when you think about animals. Most animals, you can think of the cells are typically diploid, which means they have two sets of DNA. So for some reason, fungi went down a different evolutionary path where their cells are generally haploid. And I don't know what the advantage of that is, but it's different. They have a cell wall made of chitin. Chitin is a similar material found in like the exoskeleton of crayfish and insects. So that's their cell wall. It's not made of cellulose like plants. So the cell wall is not the same as it is in plants. Okay. So they have many roles. They're good decomposers. So they break down a lot of material. They are parasitic. Like for example, like athlete's foot. They are a food source, and we can eat them. And they also play a pretty important role in medicine through the production of like antibiotics, like penicillin, for instance. Now, in terms of the actual body plan of a fungi, body plan is kind of a thread-like in appearance. So here on the left, we see this typical mold, and if you zoomed in, you would see this thread-like appearance. Thread is called hypha. Okay. And then on the right, you see basically the nuclei, and you can see sometimes the nuclei, there's no like cell wall division. That's not really that important. Okay, there's just another picture of that. So you can see in this case the cell walls. There's no cell walls here. Here's a picture of the now also the hypha. So the hypha, as one thread is called a hypha. A bunch of them are called a mycelium. So here's a mycelium. Okay. Now, one of the things that fungi do is they produce these things called spores. You may hear about spores in biology. Spores are cells that reproduce asexually. So they're similar to gametes, but gametes, you think about sexual reproduction, like an egg cell and a sperm cell need to get together, whereas a spore can just start to divide on its own. So here's a neat little picture. The spores are actually contained in the visible part of this fungi, so it would be basically this section over here, okay? This section, this actually is just a small part of the fungi. Most of the fungi would actually be embedded in the substrate that it's actually breaking down or decomposing, okay? It's also called the fruiting body. So the fruiting body is the section that produces these spores. So here's a neat little picture of a spore germinating. So here's a spore. It's a cell basically that will reproduce by mitosis. You'll see it start to form hypha, and eventually many hypha will form the mycelium. Here's a neat little picture of that too. This is like, for example, fungi invading. This would be a leaf. Okay, so you can see the spore. So the spore would basically be thrown up into the air. So often you hear about, like for example, schools have a problem with mold. The problem there is if the spore is getting, released in the air, and then you inhaling that and causing biological issues. So some people are very susceptible to this, and you have to be careful. Here you can see that spore basically growing and germinating inside a leaf. Okay, so let's look at the four different groups of fungi. So we have the tritiomycotes, the zygomycotes, the ascomycotes, and the basidiomycotes. Okay, and there is another group called the deuteromycotes that do not fit into any of these four categories. Here is just some information about the groups. Okay, so we'll look at the tritiomycotes first. So we have some examples. here. So here's Allomyces, or an example of a tritiomycote, and a zygomycote would be like a common black bread mold that you might see growing on bread over some time that's been left out. And then we have the ascomycotes, and here are some examples of members in that group. Okay, yeast, for example. Then we have the basidiomycotes, and then your common mushrooms that you would buy in the grocery store. Okay, so let's take a look at these groups. So here are the tritiomycotes. Now this is considered to be the most primitive group. And what's interesting about them is they actually have a flagella, and they're the only ones that have a flagella. So here's an example of a tritiomycote. Now, if you remember, they belong to a group called the opisthokonts, and the opisthokonts, remember what a choanoflagellate looks like. It has basically a collar. So choanoflagellate is a cell that has a collar like this, and then there's a single flagella. So the flagella seems to be an ancestral characteristic, and the tritiomycotes have retained that flagella, but you can see here that it's actually lost in the other three groups of fungi. So remember, sometimes the loss of a characteristic is just as important as gaining a characteristic in terms of defining groups. So here's an example of the life cycle of a tritiomycote. This is a fungi called Allomyces. So you can see that there's actually there's asexual reproduction going on over here. Oops, sorry. Apologize. Yeah, so you can see this is some asexual reproduction, and then we can also see the sexual reproduction life cycle too. So you actually see a little bit of both. Just telling you that fungi can reproduce sexually and asexually. So so that's it for this group, the tritiomycotes. Again, the most primitive group. You can see the fungi here. Okay, and you'll see that in all the other groups there is no there's flagella. You can see the flagella here, but you'll see in the other groups that there is no flagella. Okay, zygomycotes. Zygomycotes are fungi that do not have a flagella. So one example would be Rhizopus stolonifer, which is the common black bread mold. Okay, so again here it's very similar life cycle to what you saw before with the tritiomycote. You see there's a sexual and asexual phase. You can see that here. You can see that there is an asexual phase over here, and then we have a sexual phase over here. So the idea in sexual reproduction is you have to have, you can see on this side, two compatible strains, kind of like male and female components coming together. So the plus minus just refers to this compatibility. So if they were like, for example, 2+ strands, they would not be compatible. So you can see that they would come together over here, they would fuse, and then what happens is in the fusion, because these are haploid, you can see they're haploid, which means they only have one set of DNA. So 1 plus 1, if they fuse, would give you the diploid stage. So what you have in here in this structure is basically cells that have 2 sets of DNA. But then the cells that have 2 sets of DNA would undergo meiosis, which is what we see in animals. And then the diploid structures become haploid, and they produce all of these spores. Okay, and the spores are the things that would be released into the air, and then they would germinate. Now they don't have to do this. They don't have to go through sexual reproduction. They could undergo just asexual, so they don't get. You see on over here, there is no fusion of positive and negative strands. Okay. But in the end result is still the production of these spores, okay, that get thrown up into the air. The structure that you're seeing here that contains the spores is called the zygospore. Okay, so I think zygomycote has a zygospore. Okay, here's a picture of that. So in here you would have those diploid cells that would eventually undergo meiosis. You can see it here, okay? In this picture here, those cells are ready to be discharged. So all those spores now, which are haploid cells, are ready to be discharged and released into the air to go basically find something else to grow off of. Now, again, what defines the zygomycote from the tritiomycote is the loss of the flagella. So now we've talked about tritiomycotes and zygomycotes. We have two other groups to discuss, which are the ascomycotes and the deuteromycotes. And they're different, and I'll show you what the difference is in a second. So ascomycotes are fungi, and obviously they're fungi. They're fungi that basically produce a structure called an ascospore. Okay, and here's what that ascospore looks like. Okay, so you can see in this picture these little structures, and inside, if you actually look, you can actually see the spores. Okay, now what you notice, this should actually be, if you can probably tell, if you can get a clear image of this, in each of these structures there's actually 8 spores, and we'll talk about why there's 8 spores in a second. So this is the life cycle of an ascomycote, right? Again, you see that there's asexual and there's a sexual phase. So with the asexual reproduction, there's no fusion, but with the sexual reproduction, there is. And if you look, it looks very similar. So you'll get, 2 compatible strands that will come together. And you can see in this picture here, you can see that they start to fuse. But what's interesting in that you don't see in the zygomycotes is a stage called the dikaryotic stage, where the cells actually have 2 nuclei that don't fuse. So in the zygomycotes, this dikaryotic stage doesn't exist. So the zygomycotes just basically go from fusion to the diploid stage, and then the cells undergo meiosis to become haploid again. So that's different, this dikaryotic stage. That this dikaryotic stage, for some reason, I don't know what the advantage of it is what you'll see in this group and in the next group, which are the basidiomycotes. Now, what distinguishes the ascomycotes from the basidiomycotes is after they undergo meiosis, and if you remember from grade 9 or 10 biology, one cell will divide twice to form 4 cells. So one cell will become 4 sperm cell or 4 egg cells. And you see that here. So the cells will fuse, and then you see here, you see one round of division gives you 2 cells, and then another round of division gives you 4 cells. But in the ascomycotes, they go one step further, and they have one more round of mitosis. So you end up with a structure called an ascospore that actually has 8 spores in it, and then those 8 spores will get released. So if you go back to this picture, and I might be able to count, depending on how good the image is, 8 of these spores in one of these structures. So here is a picture of an ascomycote. So here's penicillium. Okay, this is the source for penicillin, which is an important antibiotic. Here's another example of an ascomycote. This is the black truffle. Okay, here's another one, the brown cup fungus. Now, you'll notice one thing about this group. This kind of, when you see the next group, to me, it looks like this one's like an upside down version of the next group. Or you can think of the next group as an upside down version of this group. And you'll see what I mean by that when I show you a picture of the next group, basidiomycote. So the basidiomycote is the last group we'll look at. Okay, so we talked about the zygomycotes form these things called zygospores, and the ascomycotes form ascospores. The basidiomycotes form these things called basidiospores, and we'll look at how that actually works. Here's a picture of a basidiomycote, and again, look, these are the gills right here. So, and you'll notice that they're actually facing down. Whereas if you look at the gills of an ascomycote, they tend to be facing up. So that's one neat little difference between them. Here's an image of a basidiospore. Okay, so you can see here these structures. Okay, right here. These are where you find the reproductive cells. Okay, so let's take a look at the actual the life cycle. So they also have a dikaryotic stage, and you'll see that. Okay, so it's very, very similar. You see here where it's the same idea. You get the fusion of two compatible strands. Okay, they come together and they have this dikaryotic stage where the cells will have basically two haploid nuclei that don't fuse yet. So for some reason, again, they halt this fusion process. Don't know what the advantage of that is. And then eventually they undergo this fusion where they become a diploid stage. So you can see the nuclei fusing right over here. And then the cells undergo meiosis. So you get one round of meiosis, which gives you two cells, another round which gives you four, and then here's your basidiospore. And again, it's similar to the ascomycote because they both have the dikaryotic stage. But what's different is they don't have, after the second round of meiosis, they don't have that extra round of mitosis. So you can see they're very similar to ascomycotes, but there is a little bit of a difference there. Here's another picture of a basidiomycote. Okay. Here's another one, jack-o'-lantern mushroom. Here's a turkey tail, giant puffball. Okay. The typical mushrooms you buy in the store to eat, those are most likely going to be basidiomycotes. You know, the button mushrooms that you buy in the store, those are basidiomycotes. Then there's the deuteromycotes, which we won't talk about because they don't really fit into any of these categories. Now, a lichen is an example of an organism that is two things. It is composed of fungi with a plant. So here's a picture of lichen, different types. Okay, here's another one, some different types of lichens. So this is an interesting organism because it's part fungi and part plant. So we talked about classification where we're trying to figure out what something is. What does it fit in? What category does it fit in? Well, sometimes an animal or an organism could fit into maybe more than one category. So is this what is this? I mean, a lichen is a plant-like fungi, fungal-like plant. Actually a combination of the two things, the plant and the fungi. So they work together. The plant gives it nutrients through the production of food, like photosynthesis. The fungi gives it nutrients so that it can make the food. So they work together. Okay, now, fungi. We talked about fungi and how they have many roles. We know that they're really good at decomposing stuff. You leave some food out for a while and you'll notice that fungi will start growing on it, trying to break it down. They're important for plants. So I'll show you a picture here. These are plants, red seed, are grown without mycorrhizae, which is a type of fungi. And this is the same plant grown with mycorrhizae. So you can see that fungi are really important in not only breaking down material, but they're also important in healthy plant growth. And here's another picture of that. So on the left is an example of a plant grown without mycorrhiza, but the two on the right do have mycorrhiza. So they're important for decomposing. They're important for healthy plant growth. They also are important for making certain things like alcoholic beverages, for food, for medicine. We talked about penicillin. Okay, but however, there is a dark side of them because, yeah, they do cause disease. So, for example, here this is corn smut. Nothing great for your farmer. That could ruin your crops. But also, for example, for humans, we do get, often we get like fungal infections. So, for example, here's athlete's foot. So that's basically it for fungi. It's a very brief survey. But again, the main idea is in this unit is to look at the groups and be able to compare and contrast the different groups. Okay? That is it. The End.